It was about 3:30 on an August afternoon when I found myself looking down upon All Hallows, and at first glimpse of it, every vestige of fatigue passed away. Having at last reached the end of my journey, dust, heat, wind, having come limping out upon the green sea bluff beneath which lay its walls, I confess the actuality excelled my dreams of it. What most astonished me, perhaps, was the sense not of its age, but its air of abandonment. It lay couched there as if in hiding in its narrow sea bay. No other roof, not even a chimney, was in sight, only the dark blue arch of the sky and that gaunt coast fading away into the haze of a west over which were already gathering the veils of sunset. I should have come earlier. The distance was of little account, but 9 flinty hills in 7 miles is certainly hard commons. No, I shall not forget that walk, or the conclusion of it, when all but dead beat I stretched my aching limbs on the turf which crowned that last hill, and feasted my eyes on the cathedral. I continued for a while to watch All Hallows, to spy upon it, and no less intently than a sentry, who, not quite trusting his eyes, has seen a shape approaching in the dusk. Those gigantic statues, for example, which flanked the base of the tower, images of angels and saints I had learnt from my guidebook. Only 6 of them could be visible from where I sat, and yet I found myself counting them again and again, for my first impression had been that 7 were in view. But what folly to have been frittering time away at an hour when no doubt the cathedral would soon be closed. There was but one faint chance left of making an entry, and so at last I found my way into All Hallows, entering by a dwarfish side door with zigzag mouldings. There hung for corbel to its dripstone a curious leering face, its forked tongue out to give me welcome, and an appropriate one too for the figure I made. But once beneath that prodigious roof-tree, the hush, the coolness, the unfathomable twilight drifted in on my small human consciousness. Except for the windows over my head, filtering with their stained glass the last radiance of the sun, there was but little visible colour, and an economy of decoration. To the east, a dark wooden multitudinously figured rood screen shut off the choir and the high altar from the nave. I seemed to have exchanged one universal actuality for another, the burning world of nature for this oasis of quiet. 20 or 30 paces away, an old man was standing. To judge from the black and purple gown he wore, he was a verger. He had not realized, it seemed, that a visitor shared his solitude. He was listening. His head was craned forward, and as I watched, he raised his eyes and scanned the complete upper regions of the northern transept. He continued so long in the same position that I at last determined to break in on his reverie. At the sound of my footsteps, he turned. He resembled one of those old men whom Rembrandt delighted in drawing, the knotted hands, the black drooping eyebrows, the thin-lipped ecclesiastical mouth. White as a miller with dust, hot and draggled, I was hardly the kind of visitor that any self-respecting custodian would welcome, but he greeted me with every courtesy. I apologized for the lateness of my arrival. Until I caught sight of you, I hadn't ventured far, otherwise I might have found myself a prisoner for the night. The old man smiled.
As a matter of fact, sir, the cathedral is closed to visitors at 4. Services are not as frequent as they were. Visitors are rare, too. We are too far out of the hurly-burly to be much intruded on. Not that them who come to worship are intruders, far from it, but most that come are mere sightseers.
Well, I cannot claim to be a regular church-goer, I said. I am myself a mere sightseer, and yet, even to sit here for a few minutes is to be reconciled.
Ah, reconciled, sir, the old man repeated. I can well imagine it after a journey on such a day as this, but to live here is another matter.
It must be desolate in winter.
We have our storms, sir, he agreed. You'd be astonished at the power of the winds.
I mustn't detain you, I said, but you were saying that services are infrequent now. Why is that?
Pray, don't think of keeping me, sir, but I was supposing you may have seen something that appeared in the newspapers. We lost our Dean, Dean Pomfrey, last November.
I held my peace, and the old man, as if to make amends, asked me if I would care to see the building.
The light is smalling, he explained, but if we keep to the ground level, there'll be a few minutes to spare, and we shall not be interrupted if we go quietly on our way.
For the moment the reference eluded me. I could only thank him for the suggestion. I explained, too, that I had read of Dr. Pomfrey's illness.
Aye, sir, a saint, if ever there was. But it's worse than illness, sir. It's oblivion.
He dropped his voice.
But sharing one's troubles is sometimes a relief. You see, sir, I am myself, and have been for 12 years now, the Dean's verger. And our Dean was a man who was all things to all men. None of your apron and gaiter high in mightiness whatsoever, sir. And then that. And to come on us without warning, or at least without warning as could be taken as such.
I followed his eyes into the darkening spaces above us. A light like tarnished silver lay over the soundless vaultings.
You must understand, sir, the old man continued, the procession for divine service proceeds from the vestry, out under the rood screen and into the chancel there. If you stand to the right, you will see the altar screen, 14th century work, Bishop Robert de Beaufort, a unique example. But what I was saying is that when we proceed for the services, it has always been our custom to keep close together. Well, on that afternoon, I had turned as usual to bow Dr. Pomfrey into his stall, when I found to my consternation he wasn't there. The old gentleman had left the vestry with us, that I knew, and then not a vestige. I hurried back, thinking he must have been taken suddenly ill. And yet, sir, I was not surprised to find the vestry vacant. No, our beloved Dean was gone forever. He had been, the old man whispered the words, abducted, sir. Abducted? He was found, sir, late that night, sitting in a corner, weeping, a child. He didn't know us, sir, didn't know me. Just simple, harmless, memory all gone. If you will just follow me, he whispered. There's a little place where I make my ablutions that might be of service, sir. We could converse there better.
The old man turned and led the way with surprising celerity, and came to a nail-studded door. He opened it, and admitted me into a recess under the central tower, whose only illumination was that of the ebbing dusk from within the cathedral. With trembling rheumatic fingers he lit a candle and pushed open another door.
You will find a basin and a towel in there, sir.
I entered. A print depicting the crucifixion was tacked to the wall, and beneath it stood a tin basin and jug on a stand. Never was water sweeter. I laved my face and hands and drank deep, my throat like a parched river course after a drought. When I returned, the old man was standing before the window.
All Hallows, I might say, sir, is my second home. I have been here, boy and man, for 55 years. Dr. Pomfrey might be with us now in his own self, if only common caution had been observed. But now that the poor gentleman is gone beyond all that, there is no hope of action left. They meet and they have one expert, then another down from London. And I don't say they're not knowledgeable gentlemen, but why not tell all? Why keep back what we know? It's we, sir, and not the rest of the heedless world outside who are responsible. And what I say is, no power here or hereunder can take possession of a place while those inside have faith enough to keep them out. But once let that falter, the seas are in. And when I say no power, sir, I mean with all deference, even Satan himself.
What is wrong here? I asked.
Wrong, sir, Why, I am not doubting that the gentlemen I have mentioned have the salvation of the cathedral at heart, but they refuse to see how close to the edge of things we are, and how we are drifting. So far as my knowledge tells me, there is no sacred edifice in the kingdom of a peace, that is, with All Hallows, that is so open, I mean, sir, to an attack of this terrifying nature.
Terrifying?
Terrifying, sir. Where else, may I ask, would you expect the powers of darkness to congregate in open besiegement than in this narrow valley? First, the sea out there. Are you aware, sir, that ever since living remembrance, flood tide has been gnawing its way into this bay to the extent of 3 or 4 feet per annum? And think of the floods and gales that fall upon us autumn and winter through. They make the roads well nigh impassable. Are you aware, sir, I continue, that as we stand now we are above a mile from the nearest human habitation? I warrant that if, and which God forbid, you had been shut up here during the night, and it was a near thing, but what you weren't, I warrant you might have shouted yourself dumb with not a human soul to help you.
Well, I smiled. As a small boy, one of my particular fancies was to spend a night in a pulpit.
But I take it, sir, if you had ventured to give out a text up there in the dark hours, your innocent young mind would not have been prepared for any kind of congregation.
You mean this place is haunted?
I mean, sir, that there are devilish agencies at work here.
He raised his hand.
Don't, I entreat you, dismiss what I am saying as the wandering of a foolish old man. I have heard them with these ears. I have seen them with these eyes, though whether they have any positive substance, sir, is beyond my small knowledge. But of what they can do, I can give you definite evidences.
But surely every old building is bound to show symptoms of decay.
I must apologize, the old man interrupted me. I'm a poor mouth at explanation, sir. Decay, settling, dissolution. I have heard these words bandied from lip to lip, and they fill me with nausea. Why? I am speaking not of dissolution, sir, but of repairs, restorations, not decay, strengthening, not a corroding loss, an awful progress. I could show you places, sir, where stones as rotten as pumice have been replaced by others fresh quarried, and nothing of their kind within miles. There are spots where massive blocks have been pushed into place by sheer force. All Hallows is safer at this moment than it has been for 300 years. They meant well, them who came to see, full of fine talk, and went dumb away, but at heart, sir, they were cowed, horrified.
He stood gazing through that narrow inward window.
I have not spent 60 years in this place without paying heed to my own thoughts. Look at your newspaper, sir. What they called the Great War is over, and he'd be a brave man who would take an oath before heaven that that was only of human designing. And yet, what do we see around us? Nothing but strife and juggleries and hatred wherever you look. And the church, sir. If you had told me that you were a regular churchman, I shouldn't be pouring out all this to you now. But being not so gives me confidence. By merely listening, you can help me, sir, though you can't help us.
You see, sir, he went on dejectedly,
I can bear what may be to come. Tell me the worst, and you will have done an old man a service he can never repay. Tell me, on the other hand, that I am merely groping along in a network of devilish delusion, sir. Well, in that case, I hope to be with my master, with Dr. Pomfrey, as soon as possible. We were all children once. I sometimes find myself looking at a young child with little short of awe, sir, knowing that within its mind is a scene of peace and paradise of which we older folk have no notion, and which will fade away out of it as life wears in.
I was at a loss to answer him.
The fact is—" he looked cautiously about him, "what I am now being so bold as to suggest may put you in physical danger. On the other hand, we can leave the building at once, if you are so minded. In any case, we must be gone before dark sets in. Even mere human beings are best not disturbed at any night work. Besides, I once delayed too long myself."
Perhaps if I'd been a little less credulous or less exhausted, I should have begun to doubt this old creature's sanity. But then there was All Hallows itself to take into account. Even now, in this remote candlelit room, the vast edifice seemed to be gently and furtively fretting its impression on my mind. "I only wish I could be of any real help," I said. The old man's expression changed, as if at the coming of a light.
"Why then, sir, let us be gone at once. You are with me, sir. That was all I hoped and asked. Now there's no time to waste."
He lowered his voice.
"What I would suggest, sir, if you've no objection, is your kindly grasping my gown. There will be a good deal of up and downing, but I know the building blindfold."
He opened the door and blew out the light. We were instantly marooned in an impenetrable darkness, and we set out on our expedition. I clung, I confess, desperately tight to my lifeline as we groped onward. I found myself steadily ascending, and then in a while brushing along a gallery or corkscrewing up a new staircase. Once, to recover our breath, we paused opposite a slit in the masonry, at which to breathe the tepid sweetness of the outer air, and I caught a glimpse of the night's first stars. We then turned inward once more, ascending.
"Dead still here, sir, if you please. There's a drop of some 60 feet a few paces on."
As we approached the edge of this stony precipice, the gloom paled a little, and I guessed that we must be standing in some coign of the southern transept. It seemed the northern windows opposite us were boarded up. Gazing out, I could detect scaffolding poles, like knitting needles, thrust out from the walls and a balloon-like spread of canvas above them. For the moment, my ear was haunted by what appeared to be the droning of an immense insect. But this presently ceased.
"You will understand, sir," breathed the old man. "The scaffolding over there was put up when the last gentleman came down from London to inspect the fabric. Now, sir—"
I strained every sense, and yet I could detect not the faintest murmur under that wide-spreading roof. How long we stayed in this position I cannot say. Minutes sometimes seem like hours. Then suddenly, without the slightest warning, I became aware of a peculiar vibration. It suggested the remote whirring of an enormous millstone. My companion pressed closer.
"Do you see that, sir?"
I gazed and gazed, but saw nothing. And then, though I cannot be certain, it seemed that the voluminous spread of canvas perceptibly trembled, as if a huge hand had been thrust out to draw it aside. No time was given me to make sure. The old man had hastily withdrawn me into the opening of the wall, and we made no pause in our retreat until we had come again to the narrow slit of window.
"Well, sir?"
"It's so difficult to be sure of oneself. Have you ever actually encountered anything? Near at hand, I mean."
"Well, yes, sir. In this very gallery. They nearly had me, sir. But by good fortune, there's a recess further on, stored up with some old fragments of carving. I had had my warning, and managed to leap in there and conceal myself, but only just in time. Indeed, sir, I confess I was in such a condition of terror and horror, I turned my back."
"You mean you didn't look, but something came?"
"Yes, sir. There was a sound like clanging metal, but I don't think it was metal. It drew near at a furious speed, then passed me, making a filthy gust of wind."
"And no other sound?"
"No other, sir, except in the distance a noise like a stupendous kind of gibberish. No human sound. The air shook with it. You see, sir, I myself wasn't of any consequence, I take it, unless a mere obstruction. But I have heard it said that the rarity of these happenings is only because it's not any sort of pleasure for such beings, such apparitions, sir, good or bad, to visit our world. Did you hear anything then, sir?
His gentle mumbling ceased, and we listened together. But every ancient edifice has voices and soundings of its own. There was nothing audible I could put a name to, only a faint perpetual whir of grinding, such as, to overstimulated senses, the stablest stones set one on top of the other might make. "And now, sir," he continued with a sigh of weariness, "would you perhaps follow me onto the roof? It is the last visit I make." We had not far to go. The old man drew open a heavily ironed door at the head of a flight of stairs, and admitted us at once to the leaden roof. The last faint hues of sunset were fading in the west. We edged softly along, to find ourselves now all but tete-a-tete with the gigantic figures that stood sentinel at the base of the tower. The old man peered cautiously about him as we advanced. Once, with a hasty gesture, he drew me back and fixed his eyes on a figure which was silhouetted against the starry emptiness, a forbidding thing enough, viewed in this vague luminosity which seemed to be perceptibly stirring on its wind-worn pedestal. But no. "All's well," the old man signalled to me, and we pushed on. At last we completed our circuit of the tower, and stood eyeing one another like conspirators. Maybe there was a tinge of incredulity on my face. "No, sir," murmured the old man. "I expected no other. The night is uncommonly quiet. They seem to leave us at peace on nights of quiet. But we must be getting home." The notion of fumbling down again into the blackness was singularly uninviting. To gain a moment's respite, I inquired about getting a bed for the night in the village, and, as I had hoped, the old man himself offered me hospitality. I thanked him, but still hesitated to follow, for I was trying to discover what peculiar effect of darkness a moment before had deceived me into the belief that some small animal, a dog, I guessed, had taken cover behind the stone buttress nearby. But that apparently had been a mere illusion. Nothing stirred now. "You were saying," I pressed him, "that when repairs at the building were in contemplation, even the experts were perplexed by what they discovered. What did they say?" "Say, sir? Examine that balustrade which you're leaning against. Look at that gnawing and fretting above the lead. All that is honest wear and tear, constant weathering of rain and wind. But now compare it, if you please, with this St. Mark here." I stooped close under the huge grey creature of stone, and I confess I could find not the slightest trace of fret or friction. Far from it. The stone had been grotesquely decorated in low relief with a two-headed crocodile, and the undulations of the creature were cut as sharp as with a knife in cheese. "Now, cast your glance upwards, sir. Is that what you would call a saintly shape?" What I took to represent an eagle was perched on the image's lifted wrist, but lowering and vulture-like. The head of the figure was poised at an angle of defiance. Its whole aspect was undeniably sinister and intimidating. "Aye, sir, and so with some of the rest of them," the old man commented. "There are other wills than the Almighty's." "But one doesn't repair in order to destroy." "No, sir. And why not? To give strength for evil purposes. Would that be time wasted, if such was your aim? An institution may be beyond dying, sir. It may be being restored for a worse destruction. And 100 trumpeting voices would make no difference when the faith and life within is tottering to its fall." Somehow this muddle of metaphors reassured me. Obviously the old man's wits had worn a little thin. "And yet you are taking it for granted," I expostulated, "that, if what you say is true, a stranger could be of the slightest help." The old man laid a trembling hand upon my sleeve. "Have patience with me, sir. I could never express the gratitude I feel.
You have given me the occasion to unbosom myself, to make a clean breast, as they say. You couldn't help me, except only by your presence here. God alone knows who can."
At that instant, a dull, enormous rumble reverberated from within the building, as if a huge block of stone had been dislodged. The flags on which we stood seemed to tremble. The fingers tightened on my arm.
"Come, sir, we must be gone at once. We have stayed too long."
But we emerged into the night at last without mishap. The little western door, above which the grinning head had welcomed me on my arrival, admitted us to terra firma again, and we made our way up the steep sandy track. We turned at the summit and looked back. All Hallows lay beneath us, resembling some natural prehistoric outcrop of that sea-worn, rock-bound coast, but strangely human and saturnine. But far out to sea, summer lightnings were now in idle play, flickering into the sky like the unfolding of a signal, planet to planet, then gone. That alone may have accounted for the faint vitreous glare that seemed to glitter across the windows of the northern transept. And yet how easily deceived is the imagination! I could have vowed this was no reflection, but the glow of some light shining fitfully from within, outwards. The old man paused beside the gate leading into his garden.
"You will forgive me, sir, for mentioning it, but I make it a rule to leave all my troubles outside when I come home. My daughter is a widow, and not long in that sad condition, so I keep as happy a face as I can on things. And yet, well, sir, I wonder at times if a personal sacrifice isn't incumbent on them that have their object most at heart. I'd go out myself very willingly, sir, if there was any certainty in my mind that it would serve the cause. It would be little to me if—" He made no attempt to complete the sentence. On my way to bed that night, the old man led me in on tiptoe to show me his grandson. I stooped over the child's cot. The boy was of that fairness which almost suggests the unreal. He had flung back his bedclothes, as if innocence in this world needed no covering or defence, and lay at ease, the dews of sleep on lip, cheek, and forehead. "The lovely thing," I muttered. "Where is he now, I wonder?" And from out of the distance there came the first prolonged whisper of a wind from over the sea. It was 11 by my watch. The storm after the heat of the day seemed to be drifting inland, but All Hallows apparently had forgotten to wind its clock.
When murky winter dusk begins to settle over the railway station at Crewe, its first-class waiting room grows steadily more stagnant. The grimed windows do little more than sift the failing light, and the massive black leather furniture becomes less and less inviting. It appears to have been made for a scene of extreme and diabolical violence that one may hope will never occur. Things like this become exaggerated in memory, and the afternoon I have in mind is many years distant, but I certainly became more conscious of the defects of my surroundings when my fellow passengers hurried out for the down train, leaving me to wait for the up. And nothing and nobody, as I supposed, but a drowsy fire for company. The animated talk before we parted had been occasioned by an account in the morning's newspapers of the last voyage of the Hesper. She had come in the evening before, days overdue, and even her master had not refused to admit that certain mysterious and tragic events had occurred on board, though he preferred not to discuss them. He agreed, however, that his ship was at present in want of a second mate. But the voyage of the Hesper is now, of course, an old tale many times told, and I myself, having wearied of her mysteries, had decided to seek out the refreshment room, when a voice behind me suddenly broke the hush. It was an unusual voice, rapid, incoherent. I shifted my chair and turned to look. Evidently this, the only other occupant of the room, had until this moment been as unaware of my presence as I of his. He seemed for a moment to be in doubt even of what I was. "I'm sorry," I said. "I supposed—" "Merely what I was saying, sir, is that those gentlemen who have just left us had no more notion of what they were talking about than an infant in the cradle." "How so?" I said. "I'm only a landsman myself, but—" He shifted a little nearer. A smallish man, muffled up in a very respectable greatcoat, at least 2 sizes too large for him. "You don't have to go to sea for things like that. But they'll find out all right, all in good time." He glanced around him. "You know where you are in a place like this, though. It's solid." "Yes, I agree. It certainly looks solid." "Ah, looks. But what is your solid, sir?" With that he rose and seated himself opposite me, and I must confess that now that he was near, I did not much care for the appearance of this stranger. In spite of his admirable greatcoat, he looked in need of a barber, as well as of medicine and sleep, a need that might presently exhibit itself in a hankering for alcohol. But I was mistaken. He asked for nothing. He just wanted company, human company. He merely, it seemed, wanted to talk about himself, suddenly plunged into his past. "I was a gentleman's servant when I began, sir," he set off. "First boot boy, then footman, and so on. Never married. Petticoats are nothing but encumbrances in the house. But I must say, if you keep yourself to yourself, it sees you through in time. What you have to beware of is those of your own calling. Domestic. That's the same everywhere. Nobody's reached much past the cat and dog stage in that. Jealousy. And if you don't stay where you're put, there's precious little chance of pickings when the funeral's at the door. The last situation I was in was with the Reverend W. Summers, in the depths of the country. Just myself, a young fellow by the name of George, and a woman who came in from the village. How long the Reverend hadn't cared for females in the house I never knew, but he was attached enough to his sister. Quite a nice lady, but we had to look alive when she was in the house. Oh, yes, but that, thank God, was seldom. She never took to the vicarage. I can hear her now, Blake this and Blake that. Too dark, too vaulty, too shut in. Trees in the front, everlastings, though open behind with cornfields. You could see for miles from the upper corridor windows, small panes that take a lot of cleaning, but George did the windows. George had come from the village, nothing but a few cottages. Why the old church lay a mile away from it, I can't say. The Reverend had private means, naturally. I knew that before it came out in the will. He was a gentleman. Give him his books, and tomorrow, like yesterday, and he gave no trouble. Mind you, he liked things as they should be. Everything had to be punctual to the minute, and the good things good. I've never seen choicer fruit than came from his houses and orchard. Though it was here the trouble began. But it was an easy place, and fair prospects too, if you could wait. The Reverend told me himself that he'd remembered me in his will, if still in his service. You know how these lawyers put it. In fact, he'd given me to understand that if in the meantime any of us went elsewhere, the one left was to have the lot, but not death. There it turned out I was in error. But I'm not complaining. I've enough to see me through however long I'm left. I might have stayed to this day if the old gentleman's gardener cared to stay too. He began it. Him gone, we all went. And that's where these fine gentlemen here were talking around their hats. What I say is, keep on this side of the tomb as long as you can. Don't meddle with that hole. They seem to forget there may be some mighty unpleasant meetings. And what about the further shore? It's my belief there's some kind of ferry plying on that river, and coming back Depends on what you want to come back for. Anyhow, they said the old house was haunted. A previous vicar had even had the place exorcised. Candles and holy water. That kind of thing. Sheer flummery, I call it. If at the beginning there was anything in that house that was better out than in, it never troubled me. At least, not at first. No, I'm not complaining. Live at peace with who you can, I say. But when it comes to as crusty a customer, and a Scotchman at that, as was the gardener, then there's a limit. Mengus, he called himself. He lived down at the lodge, and his widowed daughter kept house for him, with one little boy, harmless enough as children go, but noisy, and not for the house. Now why, I ask you, shouldn't I pick a little of this gentleman's precious fruit, or a cucumber for a salad, with our Mr. Mengus busy with the frames? I don't hold with all these hard and fast restrictions, at least outside the house. Not he, though. We wrangled about it week in, week out, and him with a temper which once roused was past all reasoning. Not that I ever took much notice of him until it came to a point past any man's enduring. But duty is duty, and when a man takes advantage of what is meant in pure friendliness, well, one's bound to make a move. What I mean to say is, I used occasionally, pantry window wide open and all that, I used occasionally to offer our friend a drink. But it came to become a kind of habit, and to be expected, which is always a bad condition of things. Well, there came along, 5 years ago, you may remember, an extraordinary hot summer, and an early harvest necessarily, and gardening is thirsty work, I will say that for it, which, being so, better surely virgin water, or a drop of cider, than ardent spirits. It stands to reason. Besides, we had had words again. Let him get his own drinks, was my feeling, and you can hardly call me to blame if he did. There was the pantry window hanging wide open, and there was the ruin of him within arm's reach from outside. I'd watch him there, though he couldn't see me, being behind the door. And practices like that, sir, as you will agree with me, can't go on. It had gone too far. And then I came down one morning to find one of my best decanters smashed to smithereens on the floor, Irish glass and all. Cats and sherry, you ever heard of it? And out of revenge, he filled the pantry with wasps by bringing in overripe plums. And so things went from bad to worse. A widower, too, with a married daughter dependent on him. No, sir, I had to call a halt to it. A friendly word in his ear, you may be thinking, might have sufficed. Believe me, not for him. Then I thought of George, not compromising myself in any way, of course, in so doing. I said to him one day, George, a word in time saves 9, but it would be better coming from you than me. You take me? Hold your peace till our friend's sober, then hand it to him. A word of warning, I mean. Say we're muffling things up as well as we can from the old gentleman, but that if he should hear of it, there'd be fat in the fire, and no mistake. You'd take it easier from you, George, the responsibility being mine. Lord, how I remember George. He had a way of looking at you as if he couldn't say bo to a goose. Bolting blue eyes, as simple as an infant's. But he wasn't stupid, oh no. And now I reflect, I think he knew our little plan wouldn't work. But there, whatever he might be thinking, he was so awkward with his tongue that he could never find anything to say until it was too late, so I left it at that. What he actually did say I never knew. But the very next afternoon, our friend came along to the pantry window and stood there looking in, swaying he was, but not with drink, just fury. "Where's that George of yours?" he said. "Fetch him out. I'll teach him to play the Holy Moses to my daughter. Fetch him out, and we'll finish it here and now." "I don't want to meddle in anybody's quarrels," I said pleasantly. "So long as George does his work as will satisfy my eye, I am not responsible for his actions in his off time." How was I to know, may I ask, if it was not our Mr. Mengus who had smashed one of my best decanters? "George is a quiet, unbeseeming young fellow," I said, "and if he thinks it's his duty to report any misgoings-on, either to me or to the Reverend, it doesn't concern anyone else." That seemed to sober my fine gentleman. Mind you, I'm not saying there was anything really wrong with him. He was a first-rate gardener, I grant you that. I noticed he was looking a bit pinched, hollow under the eyes, sleepless nights perhaps. But how was I to know his precious grandson was out the sorts with a bad throat, I ask you? "The best thing you and George can do," I went on, "is to bury the hatchet, and out of hearing of the house, too." With that, I turned away, leaving him to think things over. What else could I have done, sir? There was little light of day left in our cavernous waiting-room by this time, only the glow of the fire and the phosphorescence of the gas-lights. "If he was anxious about his grandson," I ventured, "it might explain his short temper." "Well, sir, you'd hardly go as far as to say that anxiety over his grandson would excuse him for what was little short of manslaughter. Keeping facts as facts, if you'll excuse me, our friend waylaid George by the stables that evening, and a wonderful evening it was, shepherd's delight and all that. But to judge from the looks of the young fellow's face when he came into the house, there hadn't been much of that in the time they'd had together." I said, "Sponge it down, George, and maybe the old gentleman won't notice anything wrong." It wasn't to reason I could let him off his duties. But as for the Reverend's not noticing it, there, as luck would have it, I was wrong. For some time later, George came along to me snuffling as if he'd been crying, and all that I could get out of him was that he had concocted some story to account for his looks, the like of which nobody in his senses would credit. And the next thing I heard was that our Mr. Mengus had been called into the house and given the sack there and then. Well, our friend came rapping at the back door that evening, shaken to the marrow if ever a man was, and just livid. I told him, and I meant it too, that I was sorry for what had occurred. I told him, too, that the only hope left was to let bygones be bygones. Not he. He said, and he was sober enough then in all conscience, that come what may, here or hereafter, he'd be even with him. Aye, and he made mention of me also, but not so rabid. A respectable man, too, never a word against him till then, and not far short of 60, and then—" The old creature paused until the main-line train had gone roaring through. "And then, though he wasn't found till morning, he must have gone straight out, said good-bye to nobody. He must have gone straight out to the old barn and hanged himself. And it's my belief that it wasn't so much the disgrace of the affair, but his daughter and grandson that were preying on his mind, and yet, why, he never so much as asked me to say a good word for him, not one. Well, that was the end of that, so far. And it's a curious thing to me how going back over the past clears everything up like, but at least for the time being. But it's what we were saying just now about what's solid that sets me thinking. I've been told, sir, that after cremation we amount to no more than what you could put into a walnut. And my point, sir, my point is this, that if that's all there is to you and me, we shouldn't need much of the substantial for what you might call the mere soul look of things, if you follow me, if we chose or chanced to come back. When gone, I mean. Just enough, I suppose, to be obnoxious, as the Reverend used to say, to the naked eye. But all that, being as it may be, the whole thing had tidied over, and George was pretty nearly himself again when I began to notice something peculiar. At first, maybe, a little more than mere silence. There was a strain, so to speak, as you went about your daily doings, especially after dark, and I could see that even George had noticed it, and he had hardly noticed a black beetle on a pancake. And then came something you could put word to. I'd gone out one evening after a broiling hot day to get a little air. I was thinking over what a curious thing is how one man's poison is another man's meat. For the funeral over and all that, the old gentleman had thanked me for all I'd done, You see, what had gone before had been a hard break in his trust of a man, and he'd looked up from his bed at me almost with tears in his eyes. He said he wouldn't forget it. He used the word substantial, sir, and I ought by rights to have mentioned that he was taken ill the night of the inquest, a sort of stroke, the doctor said, though he came round, I must say, remarkably well considering his age. Well, I've been thinking all this over as I walked back to the house along the field path, when I looked up, as if at a call, and saw, what I take my oath, I never remembered to have seen there before, a scarecrow. A scarecrow, in the middle of the cornfield at the back of the vicarage. Nothing funny in that, you may say, but this was early September, and it didn't look like an old scarecrow either. It stood with its arms out and hat down over its eyes, bang in the middle of the field. I knew that field as well as I know my own face in the looking-glass. Then how could I have missed it? The following afternoon I stepped upstairs to have a look at it from the windows. There was less heat haze or something, and I could see it clearer, but not quite clear enough. So I whipped along to the Reverend's study, him being still, poor gentleman, confined to his bed. In fact, he never got up from it. I whipped along, I say, to fetch his binoculars, and I fastened them on that scarecrow. You will hardly credit me, sir, when I say it didn't look quite real. I could watch it with the glasses as plain as if it had been in the touch of my hand, even to the hatband. It wasn't the first time I'd set eyes on the clothes, either, though I couldn't have laid name to them. And there was something in the appearance of the thing which wasn't what you'd expect of mere sticks and rags. I called George. His face was still discoloured, though his affair in the stable-yard was now a good 3 weeks old. Take a squint through these glasses, George, I said. Tell me what you make of that thing over there. George was a slow, dawdling mug, if ever there was one. But he fixed the glasses at last. Why, Mr. Blake, it's a scarecrow. Does the air around it strike you as funny at all? I asked him, quivering in a manner of speaking. That's the heat, he said, but his lips trembled. Well, George, I said, heat or no heat, you or me must have a look at that thing closer. Not this afternoon, it's too late. But we didn't, sir. For lo and behold, when I got up next morning and went along the corridor to have another glance at it, it wasn't there. The scarecrow, sir, was vanished. Some farmer's lout, I thought to myself, must have moved the old mommet overnight. But that being so, what was it ever put up for? Harvest done and all that. I didn't go out that day, but all day long, and I'll vouch for it, the whole 20 acres of that field lay empty. And when the moon came up that evening, I took yet another squint through the glasses from the upper windows, and I'm ready to own that something inside of me gave a sort of hump, sir, when, large as life, I saw that the scarecrow was come back again. But what I saw the instant before I began to look, and to that I'd lay my affidavit, was something moving, and pretty rapid too, and it was only as I clapped the glasses onto it that it suddenly fixed itself into what I already supposed I should find it to be. I've noticed that before. It's your own mind that learns you before what you look at turns out to be what you expect. Else why should we be alarmed by this here solid sometimes? It all looks so, but is it? Well, sir, I must say that from that moment on, I didn't like the look of things, and never have I shared a meal so mum as when George and me had supper that evening. From being a hearty eater, his appetite was fallen almost to a cipher. It was while we sat there, alone in the servants' hall, that we heard some words said. Not what you could understand, but still words. I couldn't tell from where, except that it wasn't from the Reverend. George stopped munching, his face little short of green. but except for a cockling up inside of me, I didn't make any sign I'd heard. Lock-up time came at last, and George took his candle and went up to bed. Not quite as willing as usual, I fancied. As for me, I gave a last look in on the old gentleman. All well there, and him lying as peaceful as if the end had come already. Then, coming back along the corridor, I blew out my candle and stood waiting at the windows. The moon came streaming in, and outside was almost as bright as day. But there was nothing to be seen, nor heard neither. Yet it seemed that not more than one deep breath after I had closed my eyes in sleep that night that I was wide awake again. There was something sounding about the house that wasn't natural, and no mistake. As soon as I heard it, I was on with my tailcoat over my nightshirt in a jiffy. I'd fetched my winter coat too, this very coat on my back now, and with that over my arm I pushed open the door and looked in on George. Maybe he'd heard my coming. Maybe he'd heard the other. But there he was, sitting up in bed, the moonlight flooding in on his long white face. I said to him, "What's wrong, George?" He sat looking at me with his mouth open, and I could see he was shaken to the very roots. Now, what I'd heard might be some animal prowling around outside, or it might not. If not, and the house being exorcised, as I said, I'd a kind of trust that what was there, if it was anything, couldn't get in. But naturally, I was in something of a fever to make sure. "George," I said, "it's up to us, our duty, George, to know what's what. So, if you'll take a look around on the outside, I'll have a search through on the in." George went on looking at me, though he had by this time shuffled out of bed and into the overcoat I'd handed him. "You don't think, Mr. Blake, you don't think he's come back again?" "Who's come back, George?" I asked. "Why, what we looked through the glasses at in the field. It had his look." "Well, George," I said, speaking as you might to a child, "we know as how dead men tell no tales, let alone scarecrows then. All we got to do is to make sure. You do as you're bid then, my lad. You go your ways, and I'll go mine." "I'd liefer's not go down, Mr. Blake," he said. "Leastways not alone. He said it'd be evens, not alone, Mr. Blake." "What have you to fear, George, my lad? Man or spectre, the fault was none of yours." George buttoned up the coat, and the moon on his face gave him a queer look, far away like, as if all that there was of him, this world or the next, had come to keep him company. It was the last between us. He turned his back on me and went off out into the passage. As for myself, I didn't move for a bit. There wasn't any hurry that I could see, and then presently what I heard was as though a voice had said something very sharp and bitter, then said no more. There came a sort of moan, then no more again. But by that time I was on my way, on my rounds, inside the house, and when I got back to my bedroom again, everything was quiet. And I took it, of course, that George had got back safe to his. Since the fire had faded, the fish-like phosphorescence of the gas mantles had grown brighter, and this elderly man was looking at me out of his white, almost leper-like face in this faint gloom, as steadily as George must have been looking at him a few minutes before he had descended the back stairs of the vicarage, never, I gathered, to return. "He wasn't found till morning," the old man said. "Cold for hours, and precious little to show why. Did you manage to get a little sleep?" He made no answer. "Your share, I suppose, was quite a substantial one." "Share? In the will?" "Now, sir, didn't I tell you myself that, as it turned out, wasn't so? And I don't know as what I did get has brought me anything much to boast about. I'm a free man, that's true, but for how long?" He peered round and out of the door. "I know in this world you may not have one iota of harm to blame yourself for to yourself. There may still be misunderstandings, and them that have been deceived by them may be waiting for you in the next. So when it comes to what the captain of the Hesper—" But at this moment our tete-a-tete was interrupted by a young porter carrying a bucket of coal, which he emptied onto the fire. Then he looked round. Me he passed over, but he greeted my fellow derelict as if he were an old acquaintance. "Good evening, sir," he said in that slightly indulgent voice which suggests past favours rather easily earned. "I didn't see you when I came in, and was beginning to wonder where you had got to." His patron smirked back at him, as if any such trifling human attention was a peculiar solace. This time the porter caught my eye, and his own was full of meaning. It was as if there was some ironical understanding between us which this third party was unlikely to share. I ignored it, rose to my feet. A train had come hooting into the station. It wasn't mine, but I preferred my own company just then. When I reached the door, I glanced back at Mr. Blake, sitting there in his great coat. With a mournful look, he seemed to be deploring the withdrawal of my tepid companionship. But in that dreadful, gaseous luminosity there was nothing, so far as I could see, that any mortal man could by any possibility be afraid of, alive or dead. So I left him to the porter, and, as yet, we have not met again.
I had heard rumours of Seaton's aunt long before I actually encountered her. Seaton would remark, "Oh, my old aunt, you know," as if his relative might be a kind of cement to an entente cordiale. Seaton and I were never in any sense intimate at school. I remained quite unmollified by advances on his side, unless it suited me to be magnanimous. Nonetheless, he did make advances, and on one occasion bestowed on me a pot of some mulberry-coloured jelly. In exuberance of my gratitude, I promised to spend the next half-term holiday with him at his aunt's. I had clean forgotten my promise, when 2 days before the holiday he triumphantly reminded me. We reached his home by train. It was a whole-day holiday, and we were to sleep the night. We arrived at noon. Seaton led me through the garden to show me his tadpole pond, and we loitered about a while, aimlessly. The first view I got of his aunt was when, at the summons of a distant gong, we approached the house to go in for luncheon. Seaton suddenly came to a standstill. "Look out! There she is!" She was standing at an upper window, eyes fixed on us. She watched our advance without stirring, until, imperceptibly, her eyes raised and lost themselves in the distance, so that it was out of an assumed reverie that she appeared suddenly to awaken to our presence beneath her when we drew close to the house. "So, this is your friend, Mr. Smithers, I suppose?" "Withers, aunt," said Seaton. "Well, it's much the same," she said, with eyes fixed on me. "Come in, Mr. Withers, and bring him along with you." She sat at the head of the table, facing the window, the light shining on her yellowish face, and on just such chocolate eyes as Seaton's, except hers were half covered by unusually heavy lids. Above them was the wide expanse of a remarkable brow, beneath a strange, steep bank of hair. Miss Seaton enjoyed an enormous appetite. Her example and a natural schoolboy voracity soon overcame my nervousness of her, allowing me to enjoy so rare a spread. Seaton was singularly modest. The greater part of his meal consisted of raisins and almonds, which he nibbled surreptitiously, as if he found difficulty in swallowing. I don't mean that Miss Seaton conversed with me. She merely scattered trenchant remarks and then twinkled a baited question. "And is Arthur a good boy at school, Mr. Withers? Is he first in his class?" "I think you're 8th, aren't you, Seaton?" Seaton moved his small pupils towards his aunt, but she continued to gaze at me. "Arthur will never make a brilliant scholar, I fear," she said, lifting a dexterously burdened fork to her mouth. After luncheon, she preceded me to my bedroom. It was a jolly little room. Over the washstand was a watercolour drawing, depicting a large eye with an intense spark of light on the pupil, and in illuminated lettering beneath was printed, "Thou God seest me." "But tell me, Smithers," she said, "why is Arthur so unpopular? You, I understand, are his only friend." Her eyes regarded me with such leaden penetration that I doubt if my face concealed the least thought from her. "But there," she added, "don't trouble to answer me. I never extort an answer. Boys are queer fish, and now perhaps you'd like to go into the garden. I should not be surprised if Arthur is skulking behind that hedge." He was. I saw his head come out and glance up at the windows. "Join him, Mr. Smithers. We shall meet again, I hope, at the tea-table. The afternoon I spend in retirement." Whether or not, Seaton and I had not been long engaged in riding round on an old horse we found in the meadow, before a figure appeared, walking along on the other side of the river, with a parasol lowered in our direction. Seaton at once lost all nerve and toppled onto the grass. "Was that your aunt, Seaton?" He nodded. "Why didn't she take any notice of us?" "She never does, but she sees everything." "How?" "Don't be talking of her, if you wouldn't mind." He lowered his voice. She's in league with the devil. You fellows don't realize what it is. I know I'm a bit close and all that, but so would you be if you had that old bag listening to every thought you think." "Where's your pater?" I said awkwardly. "Dead. My mother, too. She's not my aunt by rights. I mean, she's not my mother's sister. My grandmother married twice." "She gives you plenty of pocket money." Seaton looked steadfastly at me. "She can't give me what's mine. When I come of age, half of the whole lot will be mine." Seaton's aunt greeted me with a heavy and protracted smile when we sidled sheepishly into the drawing-room. "I hope Arthur has made you feel at home," she said, handing me a cup. "He doesn't talk much to me, but then I'm an old woman. You must come again, Withers. Draw him out of his shell, you old snail." She wagged her head at Seaton. I confess I found her rather disquieting company. Seaton and I ate our supper in silence and went upstairs. I had not been in bed long, I think, when I was wakened by a touch on my shoulder. And there was Seaton's face in the candlelight. "I'm sorry for waking you," he whispered. "I never sleep before 12. Not here." "What do you do then?" "Oh, read and listen." "Listen?" "All you read in ghost stories. That's all rot. You can't see much with us, but you know they're there. This house swarms with them." He raised his candle to the little watercolour. "Look at that. There's hundreds of eyes like that in this house. And even if God does see you, he takes precious good care you don't see him, and it's just the same with them." "I know you're only guying me," I said angrily. "But why is the house full of what you say? Tell me, you silly fool." He blinked at me calmly. "She brings them. She's in league. You don't know. She as good as killed my mother. I know that. But it's not only her. She just sucks you dry, and that's what she'll do for me. She simply hates to see me alive." And then I saw his face change, saw his eyes suddenly drop and fix themselves on the door, and I, scarcely daring to breathe, sat watching him. Then he gave a kind of sigh. He jerked his thumb with meaningful eyes, and I knew he meant that his aunt had been listening at our door. "Come on." I hesitated. I could see he was shivering, but it was no good showing the white feather now. Leaving the candle burning on the chair, we went out together. He descended the stairs, and I followed him, barefooted, along the thickly carpeted corridor. At the end stood a door ajar. Seaton slowly pushed it open, and we stood together, looking into a great pool of darkness, out of which, lit by the feeble clearness of a nightlight, rose a vast bed. A heap of clothes lay on the floor. Somewhere a clock ticked huskily. And the bed! I stared warily in. It was empty. "How are we going to get back without meeting her, I say? Answer me that. Oh, I wish you hadn't come here with us." He could hardly speak for his teeth chattering, and very distinctly in the hush that followed, I heard approaching a faint, unhurried rustle. Seaton clutched my arm, dragged me across the room to a large cupboard, and drew the door close to on us. And presently, as I peeped out into the bedroom, waddled in that wonderful great head and body. I can see her now, her tied-up hair, her heavy lids above those slow, vigilant eyes. She just passed across my ken in the vague dusk, but the bed was out of sight. We waited, on and on, listening to the clock's muffled ticking. Not the ghost of a sound rose from the bed, and when it seemed we had been hours in hiding and were cramped, chilled, and half suffocated, we crept out on all fours, with terror knocking at our ribs, and so back to the little candle-lit room. Once there, Seaton sat on a chair with closed eyes. "I'm going to bed," I said. "I've had enough of this foolery." So, with my candle in one hand, I took him under the arm and walked him down the corridor. His room was much dingier than mine, and littered with boxes and clothes. I huddled him into bed and turned to go. And suddenly, I can hardly explain it now, a kind of cold, deadly terror swept over me. I ran out of the room, blew out my candle, and buried my head under the bedclothes. When I awoke, sunlight was raying in on the bedpost. I got up, ashamed of the night's folly, dressed quickly, and went downstairs. Seaton's aunt was standing by the French window. She turned with a prodigious smile to inquire how I had slept, and in that mysterious way by which we learn each other's secret thoughts without a sentence spoken, I knew that she had followed every word and movement of the night before, and was triumphing over my affected innocence. We returned to school, Seaton and I, lavishly laden. I made no reference to the obscure talk we had had, and hadn't really believed half the stuff he had told me. I saw as little of him as I could after that. He left Gummidge's rather abruptly, and I did not see him again until by chance we met one summer in the Strand, outside a cheap jeweller's shop. He chatted about our school, which he remembered only with dislike, and finally informed me that he had come to town to buy an engagement ring. "How's your aunt?" I inquired at last. She's aged a good deal." He eyed me fleetingly. "I dare say you heard that that we lost a good deal of money." And somehow, poor fellow, I knew that he had lied to me, that he did not possess a penny beyond what his aunt had squandered on his too ample pocket-money. "Look here, Withers," he said as we said goodbye. "You're practically the only friend I have on earth, except Alice, and I'm not sure my aunt cares much about my getting married. She doesn't say so." He looked sidelong at the traffic. "What I was going to say is, would you mind coming down? You needn't stay the night, unless you please, but I should like you to meet to meet Alice." I arrived one hazy midday at his out-of-the-way station, to find him sitting, waiting for me. We walked up the village street, and, as on my first visit, skirted the house together, making our way to the garden at the back. But now there was an air of slovenliness, where before all had been neat and methodical. He pulled out his watch. "I think perhaps it's nearly time for lunch." Seaton's aunt, a little to my relief, did not share our meal. Seaton carved the cold meat and dispatched a heaped-up plate by an elderly servant for his aunt's private consumption. I played him a dull and effortless game of chess, until at about 5 o'clock came the sound of a distant ring. Seaton effusively excused himself, and after some little while returned with a slim, dark, rather sallow girl of about 19, in a white gown and hat, to whom I was presented as his dear old friend and schoolfellow. We talked on in the pale afternoon light. We all seemed, if it were not my fancy, to be anxiously awaiting the appearance of someone who all but filled our collective consciousness. Seaton at last proposed a stroll in the garden. Alice walked between us. There was a curious, provocative reserve in that impassive and rather long face, a half-unconscious strength of character. And yet somehow I knew, I believe we all knew, that this walk, this discussion of their future plans, was a futility. I had nothing to base such a cynicism on, except a vague sense of oppression, the foreboding remembrance of the inert, invincible power in the background, to whom optimistic plans and love-making and youth are as chaff and thistledown. We came back, silent, in the last light. Seaton's aunt was there, under an old brass lamp. Her hair was as barbarously massed as ever. Her eyelids, I think, hung a little heavier in age over their inscrutable pupils. I made my bow. "In this short interval, Mr. Withers," she remarked amiably, "you have put off youth, put on the man. Dear me, how sad it is to see the young vanishing. Sit down. And Arthur, how do you think Arthur is looking?" She surveyed Arthur and Alice with overwhelming graciousness. "I think he looks in need of a change," I said deliberately. "A change, indeed, my dear Mr. Withers. Are we not all in need of a change in this fleeting world? And you?" She turned abruptly to Alice. "I hope you pointed out to Mr. Withers all my pretty bits." "We walked around the garden," said Alice. "It's a very beautiful evening." "Is it?" said the old lady, starting up violently. "Then on this very beautiful evening we will all go into supper." And throughout this prodigious meal she talked, mainly to me, with an occasional satirical courtesy to Alice. As for Seaton, her flashes of silence were for him. "What's that you're confiding to your plate, Arthur? Satirical boy. He laughs at his old aunt. He detests all sentiments. He whispers the most acid asides. Come, Alice, we will go and commiserate with each other on our sex. The choice of two evils, Mr. Smithers." I opened the door, and she swept out. I hesitated. "Look here, Seaton. Don't you think perhaps you may not treat your aunt quite in the right way? As one gets old, you know, a little allowance does no harm. I can't help thinking she thinks you don't care for her. She's been very decent to you, hasn't she?" "Decent? My God, I don't think you quite understand Withers. But I know. Know what? I mean that I know what we see and hear is only the smallest fraction of what is. I know she lives quite out of this. She talks to you, but it's all a parlour game. She's not really with you, only pitting her outside wits against yours and enjoying the fooling. She's living on inside, on what you're rotten without. That's what it is. A cannibal feast. I tell you, Withers, she hates me. I thought you might understand, but there. So far as this is concerned, I'm as good as done. You wait. Seaton blew out the candles, and we groped our way to the drawing-room. There was a full moon shining in at the French window. Alice stood alone. "Where is she?" Seaton asked. Alice looked up. Their eyes met in a kind of instantaneous understanding, and the door immediately opened behind us. "Such a moon," said that voice. "A night for lovers, Mr. Withers. Get a shawl, my dear Arthur, and take Alice for a little promenade. Hasten, Romeo. My poor, poor Alice, how laggard a lover." Seaton returned with the shawl, and they drifted out into the moonlight. My companion turned to me, and suddenly twisted her face into such a convulsion of contemptuous amusement that I could only stare blankly in reply. "Dear, innocent children," she said, with inimitable unctuousness. I could scarcely see her eyes under their penthouse lids. "And now, tell me, what do you think of my new niece?" "She's charming." "A brunette?" "I prefer dark women." "And why?" "Consider, Mr. Withers. Dark hair, dark eyes, dark night, dark grave, dark. Perhaps the climax would have thrilled Seaton, but I was too thick-skinned. I suppose it isn't the actual darkness one admires. It's the contrast of the skin and the colour of the eyes, and their shining, just as, I blundered on, just as you only see the stars in the dark. As for death and the grave, I don't suppose we shall much notice that." "How very interesting," came the smooth answer. "I see you are a philosopher, Mr. Withers." She rose from her stool. Arthur and his sweetheart were returning along the dewy path. "You will take pity on me again, I hope. Now that my nephew is going to leave me, I shall be a very lonely old woman. Shall I not, Arthur?" "I don't think so," Seaton said in a strange voice. "He means, Mr. Withers, he means that I shall have memory for company. Heavenly memory, the ghost of other days. Sentimental boy. And did you enjoy the music, Alice?" continued the horrible creature. "You billers and cooers, I've been listening to such flattery, such confessions." She rolled her eyes at me, shrugged her shoulders at Alice, and gazed an instant stonily into her nephew's face. I held out my hand. "Good night, Mr. Withers. Come again soon." She thrust out her cheek at Alice, and we all three filed slowly out of the room. We walked without speaking up the dusty village street. At the fork of the high road I said goodbye, but I had hardly taken more than a dozen paces when a sudden impulse seized me. "Seaton!" I called. He turned in the moonlight. "If by any chance, you should care to spend a week in town between this and the day, I should be delighted to see you." "Thank you," he said. "Thank you, Withers. Immensely." And so we parted. I left Seaton and his marriage, and even his aunt, to themselves in my memory, and scarcely gave them a thought, until one day I was walking up the Strand again, and passed the jeweller's shop. I cannot say why, but a vivid recollection returned to my mind of our meeting, and of how suppressed Seaton had seemed. He must be married by now, and I had not sent a word of congratulation, nor the ghost of a wedding present. On the other hand, I pleaded with myself, I had had no invitation. I paused at the corner of Trafalgar Square, and at the bidding of one of those caprices that seized one occasionally, I ran after a green bus and found myself bound on a visit I had not in the least foreseen. The colours of autumn were all over the village when I arrived. I walked quickly to the house and rang the bell. The elderly servant who answered my inquiry informed me that Miss Seaton was at home. "Might I, do you think, have Mr. Arthur's address?" I said. She looked at me with astonishment. "I will tell Miss Seaton," she said after a pause. She showed me into the drawing-room, and I sat down and waited. At last the door opened, and the great face I had once known peered round at me. It was enormously changed, mainly, I think, because the old eyes had failed, and so a kind of stillness and darkness lay over its wrinkled pallor. "Who is it?" she asked. I explained myself and told her the occasion of my visit. She groped her way to a chair. "You have come to see my nephew?" "Not necessarily to see him, only to hear how he is, and Mrs. Seaton. I'm afraid my silence must have appeared—" "He hasn't noticed your silence," croaked the old voice. "Besides, there isn't any Mrs. Seaton." "Ah, then, how is Miss Outram?" "She's gone into Yorkshire," answered Seaton's aunt. "And Arthur too?" She did not reply, but simply sat blinking at me. "You must find it very lonely, Miss Seaton, with Arthur away." "I don't look to flesh and blood for my company," she said sourly, and her eyes groped over my vacant, disconcerted face. "I dare say my nephew told you a good many taradiddles in his time." "Oh, yes, a good many, eh? He always was a liar. What now did he say of me?" "I have a poor memory, Miss Seaton," I said coldly. "Why? I haven't." "Where is Arthur?" I asked. And then, suddenly, our eyes for the first time really met. In some indescribable way, out of that thick-lidded obscurity, a far small something stooped and looked out at me. She muttered something quite inarticulately, rose and hobbled to the door. I stood and looked out on the long-neglected garden. Dusk began to gather. The last birds had ceased to sing, and not a sound was to be heard in the house. I waited, on and on, and as darkness drew down, a feeling of the utmost unease and disquietude came over me. I determined to wait no longer, drew open the door, and groped my way through to the front of the house. My fingers were on the latch of the outer door when I heard a stirring in the darkness above the hall. I looked up and saw the huddled old figure looking down on me. "Arthur! Arthur!" whispered an inexpressibly peevish voice. "Is that you? Is that you, Arthur?" The question horribly startled me. No conceivable answer occurred to me. "Oh," the voice croaked. "It is you, is it? That disgusting man! Go away out! Go away out!" Hesitating no longer, I caught open the door and ran out into the garden. I found myself half up the village street before I stopped running. The local butcher was in his shop. I crossed the road and casually asked if Mr. Arthur Seaton still lived with his aunt at the big house. "Dead and buried these 3 months or more, young Mr. Seaton," he replied, "and just before he was to be married." We looked intelligently into each other's faces, but not one of the many questions in my mind could I put into words. And again I paused irresolutely a few paces further on. It was not, I fancy, merely a foolish apprehension of what the butcher might think that prevented my going back to see if I could find Seaton's grave in the churchyard. There was precious little use in pottering about in the dark, merely to discover where he was buried. And yet I felt uneasy. My rather horrible thought was that so far as I was concerned, one of his extremely few friends, he had never been much better than buried in my mind.
Which of the world's wiseacres, I wonder, was responsible for the aphorism that the best things in life are to be found at its edges? It's too vague, of course. So much depends on what you mean by best. And edges. Most of us prefer the central. It is safe. You know where you are. But amusing? Well, hardly. Quite so, as my friend Mr. Bloom would have said. But then Mr. Bloom has now ventured over the borderline. He is, I imagine, interested in edges no longer. I've been reminded of him again, as if there were any need, by an advertisement in the Times. It announces that his house, Montresor, is for sale. This charming freehold residential property, 38 acres, the matured grounds of unusual beauty, I don't deny it. But was it quite discreet to describe the house as imposing? A pair of slippers in my possession prompts this query. It is important in such matters to be clear and precise, and, alas, all I can say about Mr. Bloom can only be vague and inconclusive, as indeed he was. It was an afternoon in May. I'd been to see a friend who, after a long illness, was now creeping back into the world again. It is a relief to leave a sick room, to breathe freely again after that stagnant atmosphere. I even found myself whistling as I climbed into my two-seater. I released the brake. She leapt to life. I felt adventurous. It would be miserably unenterprising to go back by the way I'd come. I would just chance my way home. 2 or 3 miles further on, I caught my first glimpse of Mr. Bloom's house, of Montresor, and the mere quiet, diffident looks of it brought me instantly to a standstill. Imposing. It must have been built around 1750, and at second sight was merely of pleasing proportions. To all appearance, it was vacant. High-grown trees towered around it, chiefly chestnuts. The sun had set, and a diffused light hung over the walls and roof. I had been debating whether to approach nearer on foot or to drive boldly in. I chose the second alternative, with a faint notion in my mind perhaps that it would ensure me, if necessary, a speedier retreat. But then premonitions are apt to display themselves a little clearer in retrospect. Anyhow, if I had walked up to the house, that night would not have been spent with Mr. Bloom. But it looked harmless enough, and I drove under the chestnut trees to the entrance. I sat on in the car, idly surveying the scene. No notice whatever seemed to have been taken of my intrusion. So presently I got out, and mooned off to the end of the shallow stone-vase terrace. Only a dense shrubbery beyond. I sighed and turned back. I came to the conclusion that the place was unoccupied. Indeed, my foot was actually on the step of the car when, as if at a summons, I turned my head and discovered not only that the door was now open, but that a figure, Mr. Bloom's, was standing on the threshold. Mr. Bloom. A memorable figure. He was well over 6 feet in height. He was both stout and fat, and his clothes hung loosely upon him. A black morning coat and waistcoat, brown trousers, and well-cut boots. His head was bald, but his face was bushily bearded. He was surveying me from under very powerful magnifying spectacles. "Are you interested in my house?" he was saying. I made the lamest apologies, adding some trivial comment on the picturesqueness of the scene. But of this I am certain. The one thing uppermost in my mind, even at this stage in our brief acquaintance, was the desire not to continue it. Far from countenancing this inclination, however, Mr. Bloom was suggesting that I should come in. There was a suppressed eagerness in the eyes behind those glasses. And yet, even so, why should I have distrusted him? He pushed the door open. The glimpse within decided me. For the hall beyond was peculiarly attractive. It was panelled in light wood, the carving on its pilasters tinged with gilt. Empty, it would have been a fascinating room, but just now it was grotesquely packed with old furniture. It might have been some antique dealer's interior, prepared for a moonlight flit. But having thus enticed me in under his roof, Mr. Bloom rapidly motioned me on. At the dusky twist of the corridor I found him awaiting me, his hand on an inner door. "This is the study," he informed me. "One moment, though. I think I neglected to shut the outer door." Dimmed old Persian rugs lay on the floor. There was a large writing table. The immense armchairs were covered in vermilion Morocco leather, and the walls were lined with books. The lofty chimney-piece was surmounted by mouldings in plaster, some pagan scene. I was looking out of the long windows when Mr. Bloom reappeared. "You are a lover of books," he was murmuring, and we were soon conversing amiably enough on the diversions of literature. At last I bluntly held out my hand, and in spite of his protestations, made my way out of the room. Mr. Bloom followed me, cooing his regrets that I could spare him no more time. "The garden, my china." I persisted nevertheless, and myself opened the outer door, and there, in the twilight, sat my car. I had actually taken my seat in it, when I noticed that in a moment of absent-mindedness I must not only have locked the gears, but that the Yale gear key was missing. I searched my pockets, leapt out and searched them again, and not only in vain, but without the faintest recollection of having even touched the key. I turned to Mr. Bloom. He was watching my efforts with an almost paternal concern. "I've mislaid the key." "Is it of importance?" "It's the gear key," I snapped. "She's fixed, immovable, useless. I wish to heaven I—"
"Most vexatious, dear me. Do you think by any chance, Mr. Dash, you can have put it into your pocket?"
I stared at him. The suggestion was little short of imbecile, and yet he had evidently had the sagacity to look for my name on the license. "Where's the nearest town?" I said.
"The nearest... let me see. Come in again, we must get a map."
I produced my own from the car, but only an owl could have read it in that light. There was no alternative. I followed Mr. Bloom into the house again, and on into his study. He lit a couple of candles, and we sat at the writing table and examined the map. The position was ludicrous. Montresor was miles from the nearest village. I folded my map and sat glooming.
"But why be disturbed?" he entreated me. "Why, a misadventure, but of no importance. You will give me the pleasure of being my guest for the night. Say no more."
I protested, and once again began searching my pockets.
"Ah, I see what is in your mind. Think nothing of it. Yes. Comforts, convenience curtailed, I agree. But my good housekeeper always prepares a meal sufficient for two. Mere habit, Mr. Dash. And I will forage for myself." He beamed. "As a matter of fact, I am preparing to leave," he told me, "as soon as it is convenient. Meanwhile, I camp on the ground floor. It amused my secretary, this system of picnicking, poor fellow. At least for a while."
He came to a standstill on the threshold of the room into which he was leading me. Candles burned on the oak table set for our evening meal.
"I must explain," he was saying, "that my secretary has left me. He's left me for good. He is dead."
He glanced over his shoulder into the corridor.
"I miss him. On the other hand, we mustn't allow our personal feelings to interfere with the enjoyment of what I'm afraid is a lamentably modest little meal." It was by no means a modest little meal. Our cold bouillon was followed by a pair of spring chickens, the white sauce on their breasts adorned with fragments of cucumber, truffle, and mushroom. There was an asparagus salad, and neighbouring it were silver dishes of meringues and a wine jelly thickly clotted with cream.
Champagne was our only wine. Between mouthfuls, Mr. Bloom indulged in general conversation of the exclamatory order. It covered a pretty wide autobiographical field. He told me of his boyhood in Montresor. The estate had been in his family for 2 centuries. For some years he'd shared it with his 3 sisters, all now dead. By the time we'd set to work on some camembert cheese, Mr. Bloom's remarks about his secretary had become almost aggrieved.
He was of indispensable use to me in my work. Indispensable. We differed in our views, of course. No human beings ever see perfectly eye to eye on such a topic. In a word, the occult.
He laid his left hand on the table.
We succeeded in attaining the most curious and interesting results from our little experiments. I could astonish you.
I tried in vain to welcome the suggestion.
My own personal view, he explained, is that his ill health was in no way due to these investigations. My secretary, Mr. Dash, was found dead in his bed. That is, in his bedroom. Speaking for myself, I should prefer to go quickly when I have to go at all. You will agree, my dear sir, that to see eye to eye with an invalid for any protracted period is a strain. Not a happy youth, ever, but still meaning well. We shared the same interests. He had his own views, but was at times exceedingly obstinate about them. He had little staying power.
He refilled his glass.
You know the general process, of course.
And he forthwith embarked on a long and tedious discourse concerning the uses of the planchette, of automatic writing, table tapping, and all the other paraphernalia of the spiritualistic sales. Nothing I could say or do, not even deliberate yawning, had the least effect on Mr. Bloom's fluency. Lung trouble appeared to have been the cause of his secretary's final resignation. But if the unfortunate young man had night after night been submitted to the experience I was now enduring, boredom alone would have accounted for it. The cascade of talk suddenly ended. Mr. Bloom fixed me in silence under his glasses.
You yourself have possibly dabbled a little in my hobby?
I had indeed. In my young days, my family had possessed an elderly female friend, a Miss Allgood. She was gaunt, loquacious, and affectionate, and she had a consuming interest in the other world. I hear her now. On the other side, my dear Charles. Another plane, Charles. I used to go to tea with her occasionally, and she would bring out the little round table and the wine-glass and the cardboard alphabet, and we would ask questions of the unseen, and she would become flushed and excited, while she urged me now to empty my mind and now to concentrate. And we enjoyed astonishing revelations. These spiritualistic answers to our cross-examination were at the same time so unintelligibly intelligent and yet so useless that I had been cured once and for all of the faintest interest in the other side. I explained this to Mr. Bloom. I don't say that you get nowhere, but my personal opinion is that the whole business is a silly and dangerous waste of time. His eyes never wavered. Quite so, but not exactly. Nowhere, it may be. And then as I sat looking at him, his face went out, so to speak. It became vacant. The unspeculating eyes remained open, but he, Mr. Bloom, was gone. And for perhaps 2 minutes I sat there in a solitude I do not covet to experience again. Yet, as I realized even then, Mr. Bloom had succeeded in this miserable maneuver merely by a trick. The next instant his bluish eyes became occupied, and he looked at me with a leer of triumph. He gave me no time to reflect on this piece of buffoonery. So, he was informing me, shut us up or shut us down. We are what we are. And what you've been saying, my dear Mr. Dash, amuses me. Extraordinary. Most amusing. Quite so. Like a fool I mentioned Miss Allgood. I see. A superannuated novice. You pay your money, and you take your choice. Pooh, banal.
I hotly defended my old friend. Ah, indeed, an old maid. Have no fear, Mr. Dash, she is not on my visiting list. With that he took out his watch, a gold half-hunter. Now, let me see. 9 o'clock. Just 9. We have a long evening before us. Believe me, I am exceedingly grateful for your company, and regret that... But I see you've already condoned an old man's foibles. There was something curiously aimless, even pathetic in the tone of that last remark. He rose from the table, with one of the candlesticks in his hand. In his study, a dusky moonlight loomed beyond the windows. And now, Mr. Dash, your room. Where shall we be put? He stood looking at me. My secretary's now? But one has reluctances, perhaps. I myself sleep in here. He stepped across and drew aside a curtain hung between the bookcases. But there was not light enough to see beyond. The room, I propose, is also on this floor, so we should not, if need be far apart. Eh? What think we? Well, now, come this way. He led me out to a room along the corridor. It was a bed and a sitting-room combined, and its curtains and upholstery were of pale purple. The bed was in a corner by the window, and there again the dusky moonlight showed. This was the last place on earth. These walls, these colours, this bookcase, that table, which Mr. Bloom's secretary had set eyes on before setting out, not to return. How's that, then? My host watched me. I mumbled my thanks. Capital, cried Mr. Bloom. Eureka! My only apprehension. Well, you know how sensitive people can be. I leave you reconciled, then, my dear Mr. Dash. You will find me in the study. He lit the candles on the writing table and withdrew. I took one of the candles and glanced at the books. They were chiefly of fiction and a little poetry. On the writing table were a couple more, and a black book, its cover stamped diary, and on the flyleaf, S.S. Champneys. I turned to the last entry, dated just months before. Just a few scribbled words. Not me, at any rate. Not me. But even if I could get away for... The ink was smudged. A mere scrap of handwriting, and that hasty smudge of ink. They resembled an incantation. I shut the book and turned away. To my astonishment, a log fire was burning handsomely in the grate when I returned to the study, and Mr. Bloom, having drawn up 2 of his voluminous armchairs in front of it, was now encased in one of them. "I hope," was his greeting, "you found everything needful, Mr. Dash. In the circumstances, not that you wouldn't find a complete trousseau in the wardrobe. My secretary, in fact, was inclined to the foppish. No blame, no blame. Fine feathers, Mr. Dash." It is, thank heaven, an unusual experience to be compelled to spend an evening as the guest of a stranger one distrusts. Mr. Bloom did his best to make himself amusing. We discussed music and art. We talked of chance and dreams and disease and heredity, edged on to woman, and skated rapidly away. In the midst of a discourse on the progress of human thought, he suddenly inquired if I cared for the game of backgammon. "And why not? Or solitaire, Mr. Dash, a grossly underestimated amusement." But all this badinage, these high spirits, were clearly an elaborate disguise. He was keeping it up, to keep me up. And his attention was divided. One, at least, of those long, hairy ears was cocked in another direction. And at last the question that had been on my tongue most of the evening popped out almost inadvertently. I asked if he was expecting a visitor. At the moment, his back was turned on me. He was rummaging in a cupboard for glasses to accompany the decanter of whisky he had produced. His head turned slyly. "A visitor? Here? Now? You amuse me. Callers? Oh, thank heaven, not so. You came, you saw, but you did not expect a welcome. The unworthy tenant of Montresor took you by surprise, confess it. And why not? What if you yourself were my looked-for visitor? What then? Yes, I agree. I was on the watch. Patiently. In due time your charming little car appears at my gate. You pause. I say to myself, here he is. Company at last. Discussion, powwow, even controversy, perhaps. Why not? I step downstairs, and here we are. I assured Mr. Bloom that if it had not been for the loss of my key, I shouldn't have stayed 5 minutes. He chuckled. Howard, are we not forgetting that such little misadventures are merely part and parcel of the general plan? What general plan? Mr. Dash, pray let us no longer treat each other like witnesses in the witness box. Have a little whiskey? Pure malt? A tot? One of the few exasperating things about my poor secretary, Mr. Champneys, was his aversion to alcohol. His own word. £300 a year, Mr. Dash, no less. And everything found. Soda water or Apollinaris? In sheer chagrin, I drank the stuff and rose to turn in. Not a bit of it. With covert glances at his watch, Mr. Bloom kept me there until it was long past midnight, and try as he might to conceal it, the disquietude that had peeped out earlier in the evening became more and more obvious. Once he raised his hand and openly sat listening. "Tell me, Mr. Dash, was I deceived into thinking I heard a distant knocking? In a house as large as this, articles of some value, we read of violence." I inquired with clumsy irony if there would be anything remarkable in a knocking. Don't your friends from the other side ever volunteer a rap or two on their own account? A rap or two? He echoed me blandly, but his lips trembled. I had had enough, and this time had my way. He accompanied me to the door of the study and held out his hand. "If by any chance you should want anything in the night, you will remember where to find me. I'm in there," he pointed. "And now our evening is at an end. But who knows? Never matter. What must come, comes." At last I was free. I made my way to Mr. Champney's bedroom and locked the door. The one thing in my mind was relief at finding myself alone again. No talker has ever more completely exhausted me than Mr. Bloom. Half dressed, I lay down on the bed, drew its purple quilt over me, after all, Mr. Bloom's secretary had not died in it, and blew out my candle. I must have but once fallen asleep. And now, as if in a moment, I was awake again, wide awake. Night had gone. The creeping grey dawn was at the window. I lay there, stiff and cold, eyeing the door. And then I heard the sound of voices at a distance. At that, a deadly chill came over me. I stepped soundlessly onto the floor, looked about me, but in vain in the half-light for the coat I had been wearing the previous night, and slipped on instead a pair of Mr. Champney's slippers and the silk dressing-gown that hung on the door-hook. In these I was not exactly myself, but at any rate ready for action. I unlocked the door. The voices were more distinct now. One of them, I fancied, was Mr. Bloom's, but there was a curious similarity between them. It might have been Mr. Bloom talking to himself. I listened, but could detect no words. And then the talking ceased. There came a thump, and then, overhead, the sound as of someone retreating towards me. Inaction is unnerving, and yet I hesitated, detesting the thought of meeting Mr. Bloom again. But that risk had to be taken. I tiptoed along the corridor and looked into his study. The curtain between the bookcases was drawn aside. I crossed the room and looked in. Beside a chair on which a black morning coat had been flung was a small bed, half covered by a rug, and standing next to it a familiar pair of boots.
On a table lay the miscellaneous contents, obviously, of Mr. Bloom's pockets. The old gold watch, a note-case, a silver toothpick, a bunch of keys. I see them all. But I see even more distinctly a Yale key. Never until this moment had it occurred to me that Mr. Bloom himself might have been responsible for the loss of my key, that he had in fact purloined it. I stole nearer and examined it. Was this mine? I was uncertain. I must risk it. The footsteps seemed now to be thumping down the stairs, and it was unmistakably his voice that I heard. "Yes, yes, coming, coming!" Well, I had no wish to meddle in any assignation. What, as I turned round, I was not prepared for was the spectacle of Mr. Bloom's bed. When I entered the room, I am certain that it had been empty. Not so now. The lower part was entirely flat, but on the pillow, the grey-flecked beard protruding over the turned-down sheet now showed what appeared to be the head of Mr. Bloom. It was a flawless facsimile, waxen, motionless. But it was not real. It was an hallucination. How induced is quite another matter, but it was inconceivably shocking. This house was not haunted. It was infested. Without another glance at the bed, I made my way as rapidly as possible to the door and broke into a run. Just as I had left her the previous evening, my car stood awaiting me beneath the porch. My heart literally stood still as I inserted the key. But all was well. The first faint purring of the engine was accompanied by the sound of a window being flung open. It was above me and behind me. I turned my head and detected a greyish figure standing within the trees, but he too may have been pure illusion. When I blinked and looked again, he was gone, but the gabbling was increasing overhead. In an instant I had shot out from under the porch and was on my way down the drive, but to my utter confusion the gates at the end of it were heavily padlocked. I all but stripped the gears in my haste to retreat, and then, without so much as turning my head towards the house, I drove clean across the lawn. In 5 minutes I must have been nearly as many miles from Mr. Bloom's precincts. It was fortunate perhaps the day was so early. Even the most phlegmatic of constables might look a little askance at a motorist desperately defying the speed limit in a purple dressing-gown and red Morocco slippers. But I was innocent of robbery, for in exchange for these articles I had left behind a valuable jacket and a pair of leather shoes. I wonder what they'll fetch at the sale. I wonder if Mr. Bloom would have offered me Mr. Champney's £300 per annum if I had consented to stay. He was sorely in need, I'm afraid, of human company. But I ran away. Now it's too late to make amends. He has gone home, as we all shall, and taken his wages. And what troubles me is the thought of Miss Allgood. She dabbled her fingers in the obscure waters frequented by Mr. Bloom. I hate to think of the possibility of her meeting him. For whatever Mr. Bloom's company in his charming house may have consisted of, and here edges in the obscure problem of what the creatures of our thoughts are made on, and quite apart, too, from Mr. Bloom's character and effects, my chief quarrel with him was his scorn of my harmless old friend. I would like, if only I could, to warn her against him. Those affectionate, saddened, hungry eyes.
My old friend, the Count, as we used to call him, made very strange acquaintances at times. Let but a man have plausibility, a point of view, an enthusiasm, he would find in him an eager listener. I confess, however, that these cronies of his were rather disconcerting at times, and I own that seeing him one afternoon in the High Street with a companion even more than usually voluble and odd, I own I crossed the road to avoid meeting the pair.
but the Count's eyes had been too sharp for me. "You remember that rather out-of-the-world friend of mine yesterday that so shocked your spruce proprieties, Richard?" he said, as we walked together. "Well, I'll tell you a story." As closely as I can recall this story of the Count's childhood, I have related it. The house of my first remembrance, the house that to my last hour on earth will seem home to me, stood on the verge of a wide heath. The house, the garden, the deep orchard, all had been a wedding gift to my mother from a great-aunt. I remember every room of the old house, the steep stairs, the cool, apple-scented pantry. But best of all, I remember the unmeasured splendor of the heath, with its gorse and its deep canopy of sunny air. My father's will, his word, his caprice, his frown, these were the tables of the law in that small household. To my mother, he was the very meaning of her life. But nothing satisfied him. He must needs be at an extreme, and if he was compelled to conceal his discontent, there was something so bitter and imperious in his silence, so scornful of sarcasm in his speech, that we could scarcely bear it. I remember one summer's evening we had been gathering strawberries in the garden. I carried a little basket and went rummaging under the aromatic leaves. Martha was busy beside me, and in a wild race with my mother, my father helped us pick. At every ripest one, he took her in his arms to force it between her lips. And when the sun went down, he took my mother on his arm, and we all trooped together back into the cool, dusky house. As we passed into the gloaming, I saw my mother stoop impulsively and kiss his arm. He brushed her off impatiently and went into his study. I think she was happier when my father was away, for then, free from anxiety to be forever pleasing his variable moods, she could entertain herself with hopes and preparations for his return. So time went on. Yet, it seemed, as each month passed by, the house was not so happy as before. Something was fading and vanishing that would not return. On Guy Fawkes' Day, Martha told me that a new household had moved into the village on the other side of the heath. After that, my father stayed away from us but seldom. At first my mother showed her pleasure in 1,000 ways, with ribbons in her hair, with new songs, though she had but a small, thin voice. But by and by, when evening after evening was spent by my father away from home, she began to be depressed. Her anxious face, the incessant interrogation of her eyes, vexed and irritated him beyond measure. "Where does my father go after dinner?" I asked Martha one night, when my mother was in the room. "Shh, now, Master Nicholas. Didn't you hear what your mamma said? She's vexed, poor lady, at Master's never spending a whole day at home. Nothing but them cards, cards, cards every night at Mr. Gray's. But she doesn't mean to speak unkindly. It's a terrible scourge, his jealousy, Master Nicholas, and not manly to give it cause." A few days later I was sitting with my mother in her parlour, when my father entered and bade me put on my hat and muffler. "He's going to pay a call with me," he explained curtly. As I left the room, I heard my mother say, "To your friends at the Grange, I suppose." "You may suppose whatever you please," he answered. The room in which the card-players sat was very low-ceiled. A piano stood near the window, a rosewood table with a work-basket upon it by the fireplace, and some little distance away a green card-table with candles burning. After some while, the door opened, and a lady appeared. This was Mr. Gray's sister, Jane, I learnt. She seated herself at her work-table and drew me to her side. "Well, so this is Nicholas," she said, smiling. "How very kind of you to come to see me." I looked into her eyes and knew we were friends. She smiled again. "Now, let me see. I have 3 different kinds of cake, because, I thought, I cannot in the least tell which kind he'll like best. Come, you shall choose." She rose and opened a narrow cupboard. I remember the cakes to this day. Little oval shortbreads stamped with a beehive, custards and mince pies. I took a mince pie and sat down on a footstool near Miss Grey, and she talked to me while she worked. Her voice was so quiet and musical, her neck so graceful. I thought her very beautiful, admiring especially her dark eyes when she smiled brightly and yet half sadly at me. I promised, moreover, that if she would meet me on the heath, I would show her Miller's Pool. "Well, Jane, what do you think of my son?" said my father when we were about to leave. She bent over me and squeezed a lucky fourpence piece into my hand. I was looking at my father as she was caressing me, and I fancied a faint sneer passed over his face. But when we'd come out of the house onto the heath, in the bare, keen night, never before had he seemed so wonderful a companion. He told me little stories. He began 100 and finished none. Yet with the stars above us, they seemed a string of beads, all of bright colours. But when we were come to the house gates, he suddenly fell silent, turned an instant, and stared over the heath. "How weary, flat, stale," he began, and broke off. "Listen to me, Nicholas. You must grow up a man. A man, you understand. No vapourings, no posings, no caprices. It's your one and only chance in this unfaltering scheme." He scanned my face closely. "You have your mother's eyes," he said musingly. "And that's no joke." He pushed open the gate and we went in. My mother was sitting before a dying fire. "Well, Nicholas, did you play cards with the gentleman?" "I talked to Miss Grey," I said. "Really?" said my mother, raising her eyebrows. "And who is Miss Grey?" "Mr. Grey's sister." "Not his wife, then?" I looked towards my father in doubt. "You little fool," he said to my mother with a laugh. "What a sharpshooter." My mother rose, and with a sob she hurried out. My father stood very still, and then with a sigh he sat down at my mother's writing table and scribbled a few words on a slip of paper. "There, Nicholas, just tap on your mother's door with that. Good night, old fellow." I hastened upstairs and delivered the message. My mother was crying when she opened the door. But presently, afterwards, I heard her run down quickly, and in a while my father and mother came upstairs together, arm in arm, and by her light talk and laughter you might suppose she had no knowledge of care or trouble at all. Never afterwards did I see so much gaiety and youthfulness in my mother's face as when she sat next morning with us at breakfast. My father seemed to find as much pleasure, or relief, in her good spirits as I did, and to delight in exercising his ingenuity to quicken her humour. It was but a transient morning of sunshine, however, and as the brief and sombre day waned, its gloom pervaded the house. In the evening, my father left us to our solitude as usual. On St. Stephen's Day, I went to Miller's Pool. I was stooping down at the edge, breaking the splinters of ice, when I heard a voice calling me. It was Jane Grey, walking on the heath with my father. "So you see I have kept my promise," she said. "But you promised to come by yourself." "Well, so I will then." She turned to my father. "Nicholas shall take me home to tea, and you can call for him in the evening. That is, if you are coming." "Do you care whether I come or not?" he said moodily. "You are my friend. Of course I care." He scrutinized her through half-closed lids. His face was haggard, gloomy with ennui. "How you harp on the word, you punctilious Jane. Do you suppose I'm still in my teens? It amuses me to hear you women talk. It's little you ever really feel. "I don't think I'm quite without feeling," she replied. "You are a little difficult, you know." "Difficult? It's age, my dear Jane. Age. It turns one to stone. With you young people, life's a dream. Ask Nicholas here." He shrugged. "But one wakes on a devilish hard pallet." She continued to smile, yet with tears in her eyes. "You ask me to be fearless, sincere, to speak my heart. I wonder, do you?" "The truth is, Jane," my father said slowly, "I am past sincerity now. And as for heart, it is a quite discredited organ at 40. And when youth and sentiment are gone, why, go to, dear lady. Existence proves nothing but brazen inanity afterwards. But there's always that turning left to the dullest and dustiest road, oblivion. Take care of her, Nicholas. Au revoir. Upon my word, I almost wish it was goodbye." He turned with an affected laugh and left us. "What does my father mean by wishing us goodbye?" I asked. My companion bent down and put her hands on my shoulders. "My dear Nicholas, you must be a good son to your mother. Brave and kind, will you? He hardly ever speaks to mother now." She pressed her lips to my cheek. "We must do our best, mustn't we?" And then we took hands and ran till we were out of breath, towards the distant lights of the Thorns. I had been some time in bed when my mother came into my room. "Where have you been all evening?" she said. "Miss Grey asked me to stay to tea. Did I give you permission to go to tea with Miss Grey?" I made no answer. "If you go to that house again, I shall beat you. You hear me, Nicholas? Alone or with your father, if you go there again, I shall beat you." I didn't reply. But when my mother had gone, without kissing me, I cried noiselessly on into my pillow. Life had become a little colder and stranger. Hardly a week passed now without some bitter quarrel. On St. Valentine's Day, things came to a worse pass than ever. It had always been my father's custom to hang my mother a valentine on the handle of her parlour door, a string of pearls, a fan, whatever it might be. She came down early this morning and sat looking out at the falling snow. He took no notice of her. I think he had not really forgotten the day, for I found long afterwards in his bureau a bracelet, purchased but a week before, with her name written inside the case. Yet it seemed to be the absence of this little gift that had driven my mother beyond reason. Towards evening, tired of the house, I played for a while in the snow. At nightfall, I went in, and in the dark heard angry voices. My father came out of the dining room and looked at me in silence. My mother followed him. "It shall learn to hate you," she cried. "I will teach it every moment to hate and despise you as I hate and despise you." My father looked at her calmly and profoundly. "Very well, then. You have chosen," he said coldly. "It has always lain with you. You have exaggerated, you have raved, and now you have said what can never be forgotten. Pray do not imagine, however, that I am defending myself. I have nothing to defend. I think of no one but myself, no one. Perhaps, indeed, you yourself... Well, life is... I have done. So be it." He stood looking out of the door. "You see, it's snowing," he said, as if to himself. All day long the snow had been falling continuously. My father glanced back for an instant into the house, and, as I fancy, regarded me with a kind of strange, close earnestness. But he went out and his footsteps were instantly silenced. My mother stumbled to the door. "Arthur, Arthur," she cried, "it's St. Valentine's Day. That was all I meant. Come back, come back." But perhaps my father was already out of hearing. As far back as memory carried me, it had been our custom to make a Valentine's feast. This same anniversary had, last year, brought about a tender reconciliation between my father and mother, after a quarrel that meant how little then. And I remember on this day to have seen the first fast-sealed buds upon the almond tree. When I went to the dining room later, my mother was kneeling by the fireside, gazing into the flames. Martha knocked at the door when the clock struck 8. "Dinner is ready, ma'am." My mother glanced at the clock. "Just a little while longer. Tell Mrs. Ryder. Your master will be home in a minute." She rose and placed the claret in the hearth. "Did you hear anything, Nicholas? Run to the door and listen." "It stopped snowing," I said, peering out into the darkness. "But there isn't anybody there, Mother." The hours passed heavily from quarter on to quarter. Already midnight would be the next hour to be chimed. I was still hungry and very tired. The candles began to burn low. Mrs. Ryder retired with Martha. They left me, I think, to be my mother's company. We shared the steaming wine together when they were gone. We said very little, but I looked softly into her grey, childish eyes, and we kissed one another kneeling there together before the fire. But by and by, in the silent house, drowsiness vanquished me. I began to nod, and very soon dreams stalked in, mingling with reality. It was early morning when I awoke, cold and miserable in my uncomfortable resting place. My mother was still asleep. I touched her sleeve, and the lids drew back from her eyes. Her face clouded instantly. "What? Nothing, nothing?" And suddenly, in a gush of agony, remembrance of the night returned to her. She hid her face in her hands, rocking her body gently to and fro. I returned to the table, on which was set out the mockery of our Valentine feast. I put a handful of biscuits in my pocket, for a determination had taken me to go out on the heath. A project was also forming in my mind of walking over to the Thorns. I would tell Miss Grey all about my adventure of the night spent in the dining room. So, moving stealthily, I stole unnoticed from the room and ran joyously out into the wintry morning. Already dawn was clear and high in the sky, and snow lay crisp across every surface. As I went on my way, munching my biscuits, I brooded deliciously on the breakfast which Miss Grey would doubtless give me, and almost forgot the troubled house I had left behind. At length I climbed a smooth ridge and looked down. Before me grew a crimson hawthorn tree that often in past Aprils I had used for a green tent from the showers. But now it was a long expanse of unshadowed whiteness. Nearby, I perceived a figure stretched out along the snow, and knew instinctively that it was my father lying there. The sight did not then dismay me. I felt no sorrow, but stood beside the body, regarding it only with a kind of earnest curiosity, yet perhaps with a remote pity, too, that he could not see me in the beautiful morning. His grey hand lay arched in the snow. A smear of dried blood showed on his darkened face. I understood that he was dead, and had already begun speculating on what would happen in the house now that he was gone, his influence, his authority, his discord. I remembered, too, that I was alone, was master of this immense secret, and that I must go home and tell my mother. My thoughts were suddenly broken in on by Martha Rodd. She stood looking down on me from the ridge from which I had but just now descended. "Look, Martha, look!" I cried as she approached. I found him in the snow. He's dead." And suddenly a bond seemed to snap in my heart. The tears gushed into my eyes, and I clung to the poor girl, sobbing bitterly. "Oh, Master Nicholas," she cried, "what will your poor mamma do now, and him gone?" My father's body was brought home and laid in my mother's little parlour. The house was darkened. My mother was ill, and for some inexplicable reason I connected her illness with the bevy of gentlemen dressed in black who came one morning to the house and walked away together over the heath. Finally, Mrs. Marshall drove up one afternoon from Islington, and by the bundles she had brought with her, I knew that she was come, as once before in my experience, to stay. I was playing on the morrow in the hall when I heard Mrs. Marshall and Mrs. Ryder gossiping on their way up from the kitchen. "No, Mrs. Marshall, nothing," Mrs. Ryder was saying. "Not one word. And now the poor dear lady left quite alone. I knew to my sorrow that there was words in the house, but there, wheresoever you be, there's that." "Wasn't there talk of some—" "Talk, Mrs. Marshall? I scorn the word. A pinch of truth in a hogshead of falsehood." But then I was discovered, crouched on the stairs. "And this is the poor fatherless mannikin, I suppose," said Mrs. Marshall. "Well now, and don't you remember me, little man? He ought to now." "He's a good boy," said Mrs. Ryder, "and I hope and pray he'll be a comfort to his poor widowed mother, if so be." They glanced earnestly at one another, and Mrs. Marshall drew a big leather purse from her pocket and selected a bright halfpenny piece. "I make no doubt he will, poor mite," she said cheerfully. I took the halfpenny in silence, and the two women went on upstairs. In the afternoon, I went out onto the heath with a shovel, intent on building a great tomb in the snow. I laboured very busily, shovelling, moulding, stamping. So intent was I that I did not see Miss Grey until she was beside me. "Nicholas?" She sat on my shapeless mound of snow and took me by the hand. Then she drew up her veil, and I saw her face pale and darkened, her dark eyes gravely gazing into mine. My poor, poor Nicholas. What can I say? She drew back and looked out over the heath towards the house. "They've put my father in the little parlour. In his coffin, of course. You know he's dead. And Mrs. Marshall's come. She gave me a halfpenny." I took it out of my pocket and showed it to her. "That's very nice," she said. "And look, I'm going to give you a little keepsake too, just between you and me." It was a small silver box that she drew from her muff, and embossed in the lid was a crucifix. "Now, who's given you this?" she said softly, putting the box into my hand. "You." "Your friend, Jane Grey," she said. "And now, tell me which room is the little parlour. Is it that window at the corner?" I shook my head. "No, it's at the back. Would you like to see my father?" She started, her dark eyes dwelling strangely on mine. "But Nicholas, you poor lamb, where?" "If you were to come this evening, I would be playing in the hall. Nobody would see you." "Oh, what are you saying?" She stood up, drawing down her veil. "But I'll come. We can both still be loyal to him, can't we, Nicholas?" She walked away quickly. I looked at my silver box with great satisfaction, and after opening it, put it in my pocket, and continued my building for a while. But now zest for it was gone, and I began to feel cold as darkness gathered. So I went home. I ate my tea in solitude. A peculiar, suppressed stir was in the house. I wondered what could be the cause of it, and began to be afraid of my project being discovered. Nonetheless, I was playing in the evening, as I had promised, close to the hall door. "Run down to the kitchen, dearie," said Martha. Her cheeks were flushed. She was carrying a can of steaming water. "You must keep very, very quiet this evening, and go to bed like a good boy, and perhaps tomorrow I'll tell you a great secret." She kissed me hastily and hurried away. Almost as soon as she was gone, I heard a light rap on the door. It seemed that Jane Grey had brought in with her the cold and freshness of the woods. I led the way down the corridor into the small, silent room. The air was still languid with the perfume of flowers. "I'm sorry," I said, "but they've nailed it down. Martha says the men came this afternoon." Miss Grey took a little bunch of snowdrops from her bosom and hid them among the wreaths of flowers, and she knelt down with a small silver cross pressed to her lips. And while I watched her praying, I listened to the quiet footsteps passing to and fro in the room above. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a small, continuous, angry crying. Miss Grey looked up. "What was that?" I stared at her. "It sounds just like a little baby," I said. She crossed herself hastily and rose. "Nicholas," she said in a strange, bewildered voice. She looked at me lovingly, then went out as she had entered. I did not so much as peep into the darkness after her, but busy with 100 thoughts, returned to my play. Long past my usual bedtime, as I sat sipping a mug of hot milk before the kitchen fire, Martha told me her secret. So, my impossible companion in the High Street yesterday was own and only brother to your crazy old friend, Richard, said the Count. His only brother, he added, in a muse.